Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Dr. Dina Ibrahim, an Associate Professor of Broadcasting and Electronic Communication Arts at San Francisco State University. I will be your chair for today's program called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. We also welcome our guests from the Turkish Parliament, and we welcome our listening and internet audience and invite everyone to visit us online at www.commonwealthclub.org. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. A veteran of more than 20 years of human rights research and activism, Karima Bennoune is a professor of law at UC Davis. She grew up in Algeria and the United States. She has served as a legal advisor at Amnesty International and has taught at Rutgers and the University of Michigan. She's widely published on the issues of fundamentalism and counterterrorism. Would you please welcome Professor Karima Bennoune?
Thank you so much for being here today. It's really an honor for me to be here. I particularly would like to thank the Commonwealth Club for inviting me, and Celia Menschel for coordinating this event, and Dina Ibrahim for the lovely introduction. So what I want to do today is to share with you a few excerpts from my book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, Untold Stories from the Fight Against Muslim Fundamentalism. And I want to explain as well why I wrote this book. It was a very big project. I actually interviewed about 300 people of Muslim heritage from nearly 30 Muslim-majority countries, from Afghanistan to Mali. And I did this specifically to learn about their work combating extremism or their own experiences of persecution at the hands of fundamentalists. The people that I met in these 3 years were incredibly diverse. I think that's one of the most important things to note about the project. So I interviewed sheikhs, religious scholars, and bloggers. I interviewed housewives and sexual rights activists. I interviewed people who excused themselves to pray in the middle of interviews, and other people who toasted the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad with a glass of wine. So again, this tremendous diversity. I interviewed an imam's daughter in Niger named Aminatou Daouda, who promotes the UN Women's Rights Convention, or CEDAW, which unfortunately the US hasn't ratified yet. But she does this believing that the Women's Rights Convention, the CEDAW, is entirely reconcilable with her own Muslim faith. I interviewed Maria Bashir, the only woman chief prosecutor in Afghanistan, who has 23 bodyguards, and yet despite the threats, despite the actual attempts on her life, continues to prosecute in cases of violence against women and corruption, and all the while fears that the United States and the international community may be about to sell out Afghan women in the bid to, quote, reconcile with the Taliban. And the question that I asked myself time and again is, why are these people not more well-known internationally? Everyone knows who Osama bin Laden was, but very few people know about all of those on the ground who are challenging people like him. And what I really set out to do in this book is to change that, or at least to contribute a little bit toward that change. Now, I did this for very personal reasons, because my own father, Mahfoud Bennoune, was an anthropologist of Muslim heritage and risked his life throughout the 1990s to stand up to extremism in his home country of Algeria. And what I remember is that even when he was driven from his home and forced to stop teaching at the university due to death threats from the fundamentalist armed groups, he remained inside Algeria, and he continued to publish pointed criticisms of both the fundamentalists and the government that they fought. In a 3-part series published in the newspaper El Watan back in November of 1994, a very terrible time in what was called the Dark Decade in Algeria, Mahfoud Bennoune produced an article called How Fundamentalism Produced a Terrorism Without Precedent. And in that article, he denounced what he called the terrorists' radical break with true Islam as it was lived by our ancestors. Now, the Algerian Democrats, as they called themselves, like Mahfoud Bennoune and many others, unfortunately received very little support internationally at the time, including from the international human rights community where I was working. And it often seemed as though the international community could not understand what was happening on the ground in Algeria, because generally people did not grasp the threat to human rights from the ideology of Islamism itself. This was the pre-9/11 era. And let me stress, the ideology of Islamism, which is an entirely different thing than the religion of Islam, which is practiced by so many people in so many different ways, more than 1 billion people in the world. But I think that this misunderstanding of the nature of the threat of the ideology of Islamism to the human rights of people of Muslim heritage themselves actually persists today. And I would argue that we can see this at the moment in the press coverage of what is happening in countries like Egypt, for example. Now, doing this kind of work on the front lines without international support, without even international comprehension of the challenge that you face, is an incredibly lonely endeavor, and I have seen this firsthand. As a Malian lawyer named Sara Keita Diakite told me in Bamako back in December of 2012, at a time when the entire northern half of her country was under jihadist occupation, she said, "International solidarity is very helpful. When you live such a crisis alone, it is much more difficult to bear." So what my book is really about is trying to break this wall of loneliness and silence by connecting the people who are doing these struggles on the ground to people around the world who stand for similar values of tolerance and equality and against discrimination and violence. So before I tell you a few of the stories, I think I should say something about what I mean when I use the term Muslim fundamentalism, which is, of course, itself a controversial term. I give in the book the definition by the Algerian sociologist Marieme Heli Lucas, who writes about fundamentalisms, note the S, not just within Islam, but fundamentalisms, which she defines as political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion in order to achieve their political aims. Now, the Pakistani post-colonial theorist Saadia Abbas has likewise described this as the radical politicization of theology. So what we're talking about here is a political project, not a spiritual or religious one. Now, I have to be careful of projecting that there's some sort of monolith called Muslim fundamentalism that is the same everywhere, especially in a short talk like today. These movements, too, have their own diversities. Some do not use or advocate violence, and others do. But I do think we can cautiously generalize about certain shared characteristics, the most significant of which are, in my view, number one, a belief in the imposition of something called the Sharia, so a sense that what I would call Muslim laws are in fact unitary, monolithic, and are to be imposed on all Muslims everywhere. And second, the ultimate goal of creating what they deem to be Islamic states, and many Muslims would dispute entirely their definition of what an Islamic state should be like, and that state is to be ruled by that unitary version of religious laws that they advocate. Now, these movements have been on the rise since the Iranian Revolution in particular, and we find them manifesting as political parties, as armed movements, sometimes even as non-governmental organizations. Now, in response to these movements in the contemporary period, Western discourse has sometimes seemed to offer only two choices. That is, number one, the openly discriminatory or flawed characterization of all of this that suggests that somehow Islam is inherently fundamentalist or all Muslims are fundamentalist and so on. And that is clearly not only offensive, but just plain wrong. And one hears this sometimes on the right in the West. Unfortunately, on the left as well, one sometimes hears responses that are too politically correct to even broach the topic of fundamentalism at all. And in my view, neither of these sets of responses is accurate or helpful, and both do a grave disservice to the people who are living on the front lines. So what I'm trying to create is another way of talking about this in the West. Now, I should say as the backdrop to all of this that I am painfully aware that there has been a rise in discrimination against Muslims in the last few years in this country, as articulated in the far right's attack on President Obama as a sort of putative Muslim, which seems to have become a kind of offense. But my view is that even this does not mean that silence on the topic of Muslim fundamentalism is appropriate or productive. And in fact, my contention is that one of the key ways to challenge discriminatory notions about people of Muslim heritage is precisely to display their diversity. and that one of the ways to do that is to tell the stories of those who are practicing Muslims, those who are agnostic of Muslim heritage, or even atheist of Muslim heritage, who have been victims of fundamentalism and who have chosen very bravely to challenge fundamentalist movements. That's the project